Hello, it's day 7, March 29th. Kelly, I'm a little concerned. We're not going to hit our 30 days before things get complicated with our travel. So we're doing the best we can, you guys. I just want you to know that we will hit 30. It just won't be as orderly, perhaps, as it was in the past.
This won't be 30 straight days.
Definitely not now that we're back on the road. And I don't know about you. I have made some of the biggest mistakes traveling in the last month that I've ever made. I don't know if I told you, but I got home on my last trip with my writer's notebook in my bag, my carry-on bag, which I had to gate check, and TSA broke the lock. So I could not open my luggage when I got home, and my writer's notebook's in there with stuff that I had been working on that was due this week. And I was just like, what am I going to do? Local locksmith has busted it open, but now I have to figure out, the suitcase is less than a month old, how I'm going to get that whole thing replaced, because they have the right to use their key, this lock thing that TSA has, but the locksmith told me they used it wrong. So anyway, there was this moment of like, what has happened? I lost my phone the week before. So
I'm completely out of travel shape. Like there's a rhythm to it. And I went up to Portland. I got to the airport to board the plane, and I realized I didn't even bring my phone. And I didn't have enough time to go home and come back, or I would have missed the only flight. So I traveled without a phone. We went old school.
Totally.
But imagine today, on the road without a phone was very disconcerting to me.
Well, I'm embarrassed to say I landed in Grand Rapids on Wednesday, and I had not made a hotel reservation or a car reservation. I was like, what were you thinking was going to happen when you landed? So I'm sitting there on Wi-Fi in the airport going, hope I can find a place. It's just, It's hard. It's been 2 years of sitting here in this office, and it's good to be back with people, though. So I was thinking a lot about Tom Romano's conversation. A lot of people, it resonated with them. And he was part of a book, a compilation called Oops. And it was published in 1996, What We Learn When Our Teaching Fails. And I'm going to put a link on the thread, because what I got out of reading this, and this was after I'd known Tom for a few years, just the vulnerability. Every chapter says, this didn't go right. So I wanted to share a few, like, give me an example of something you did that didn't go well.
Oh, I'd love to hear one or two of those.
You're going to share one, or do I have to go first?
You go first.
Okay, so first year of teaching, I'm at a year-round school. I'm teaching 3rd grade in Southern California, and I'm rooming with 2 other first-year teachers. So we're all making mistakes every single day, and we gather. The report cards are due, first quarter report cards, and we all gather. We're at 3 different schools, and we're in the living room when all of a sudden my one roommate goes, "Oh my God, we're supposed to grade spelling?" And we all 3 look at each other. We go, "I didn't do anything with spelling, did you?" And we all start making up grades. Like, I swear, if anybody has a report card from then, I should never have told that story. It's horrible, the things you don't know.
Yeah, right. Is that my cue?
It's your turn. I'm not sharing all of them.
I remember I was hired as a long-term sub before I was fully credentialed. And we were reading To Kill a Mockingbird. This was 37 years ago. And I thought, well, it would be really good to help get the kids into the book if I read a little of it orally, kind of got them into it. But I was petrified, because it was the very first time I was actually reading a novel in front of high school kids. And this was a class, by the way, that I was the 3rd attempt to get a long-term sub in there, because the other 2 had been run out by the kids. And so I went in there, and I'm pretty nervous, and I ended up reading that a passage, and I thought, well, I did a pretty good job of that. I survived that. The next day I show up, and at my podium, somebody had drawn a picture of me and had cut it out and had pasted it to the podium with the name Mr. Mono on it.
I love that a little too much.
Yeah. So I mean, it did sort of initially plant the idea that when you read in front of kids, it is a performance and you got to up your game. I learned that, and I ended up bonding with that class and ended up liking that class a lot, but that was a hard lesson.
Oh my gosh. I wrote about this in my first book because it was one of the hardest things I've ever have happened. I was a new mother. Cameron was like 3 or 4 months old and he's bouncing in his bouncy chair while I'm getting ready to run off to work. And I pick him, as I lean over to pick him up, he pukes all over me. And I go running back into my closet and swap skirts. And I had been wearing a navy blue skirt with this outfit that's all white and navy blue. So I grabbed the white skirt, put it on, run to class, and I'm in the middle of writing on the board when Doug says from the front row, "Nice stripes, kiddo," because I'm wearing like wide stripe, brilliant blue and white striped underwear. And I'm just standing there like chalk on the board. Like there is no way I can turn around. Like I had 34 7th graders howling with laughter. Like I was just, it was devastating. But I remember so clearly that I started writing, "Doug is in big trouble." And then everybody was like,
well, I think that's how you handle it when you have that uproarious moment is you can't avoid it. You have to, you've reminded me one of my first years, I was teaching a class of beginning language learners. And some kid asked me the difference between the word through and the word through. And I wrote on the board, THREW. And I said to the class, "The boy threw the ball. The boy threw the ball." And the kid said, "Well, what's the other through?" And so I wrote THROUGH on the board. And I was just spur of the moment in front of the class. I went like this. The car went through the tunnel, and I'm doing this in front of the class, and the class explodes. And I realized midstream what the heck I'm doing.
oh my God. I was thinking, because no doubt bathroom humor and any sexual reference is going to drive us with middle and high school mostly experience, drive a class crazy. I can remember middle school teaching literary devices and saying, "This one is assonance." And there's this assonance. They like keep saying it. Yes, that's how you say it. They're like waiting for us. Right. I don't even know, more seriously, the bigger oopses that we've made. I mean, I think that the reason that I started thinking about this morning is if I pull up on YouTube that conversation with Donna Lynn yesterday, there's 2 comments and they're from the same person. And the first one says, "I wish I'd heard this conversations like this one and more 25 years ago before I started teaching high school English. I wonder now how many kids' reading lives I've damaged." And I was just so struck by that's harsh, right? In a time when we're all struggling to do what's right. I wrote back, "Your honesty humbles me. You remind me of all the mistakes I've made, in my career, etc." But then she wrote back, "Oh, just one more comment. My husband, who's 55 now, was in remedial classes in elementary school. Then in 6th grade, his reading teacher pulled out a copy of The Hobbit. She read the first chapter aloud to the class. Your first chapter Friday description brought this to my mind. He was hooked. She then pulled out a copy of The Hobbit for each child in the class. He devoured it and never turned back. He went straight into advanced classes the next year. One teacher in 1978 did that for him." Wow. And that's what made me think about what are the more serious or humbling moments that we've had about our practice, because my pedagogy looks nothing like it did when I left my bachelor's program, my first few years of teaching, because I've learned so much. And I didn't learn it at school. I didn't learn it in professional learning. I most often learned it on my own.
Talked a lot about that with student teachers, because often student teachers would come in and they'd be frustrated that they weren't at this certain level of teaching right away. And when you have a student teacher, you forget how much you've learned. As the master teacher, you take things for granted that took years of experience to kind of internal that you go to naturally. that just, and you can't get there without a ton of mistakes, a ton of oops, a ton of learning experiences.
So true.
So when you think back, like what's one example of, an oops that informed, changed your path as a teacher?
Yeah, I started in elementary school and I had taught for years, the first 10 years of my career, 3rd through 8th. And then I went to a university and taught methods, right? So I had a lot of time to really reflect on what I was doing as I was reading all this pedagogy. And I think one of the things that stands out for me is that I was giving kids assignments in writing. And I would, find a book. There was a famous book that had these daily journal prompts, and I would throw those on the board. And they were often, kids were not very inspired to write next to them because, write about your most embarrassing moment is such a lame kind of prompt. But I couldn't recognize that because I hadn't done that much writing, and not writing like performance writing. I think that's like a performance, right? I'm trying to answer your question. And so what I found was that there was a day in my 8th grade class where a student had died by suicide about a month before. And when they came into my class, I had buckets of carnations all over the room. And it was probably a month after this had happened. And I said, I just want us to write a flower memory today. It's May 1st, it's May Day. My mom used to deliver little baskets of flowers from our garden at my bedside. So when I woke up on May 1st, it was May Day. And so let's just write about a time when flowers were kind of a central thing in your memories. Those kids wrote for 15 or 20 minutes, and then they started sharing. And it wasn't about the girl who died by suicide for 99% of them. It was about other times when flowers were present at a funeral. Hadn't occurred to me that's what the way they would write. But the difference in the room, the palatable difference between opening it up with just something that, I said, smell them, remember the smell of flowers, think about, and just write what's in your head, was so different, profoundly different. And I had read Graves. I had read, probably, I hadn't read Nancy Atwell yet, but I'd read enough to know that other people were saying, let kids choose their own topics. But I was still falling back on giving kids topics, afraid they wouldn't have anything to write about. And that was really profound for me.
I hope that came through okay, because in the middle of that, you had about a 6 or 7 second freeze there.
Really?
So hopefully we're still live. But yeah, I mean, that's an aha moment that I think is really profound, right? When you talk about writing, I think about, some of the aha moments that I had. I think a lot of the grading and assessment approaches that I did early in my career were not in the best interest of kids. They were more in the best interest of me determining who gets an A and who gets a B and who gets a C. And, there's far too many of them to mention briefly, but I would just say that, and this is a cliche because it's true, but how many times have you, worked on commenting on a student paper and then they ignore it? Was really, it happened far too many times before I realized they don't need me at the end of the paper. They need me in the middle of the paper. They need me mid-process, not end process, right? It doesn't mean that I spend any less time on the paper. It meant that I would move that time from the end of the paper to the middle of the paper. They need the coaching while the paper is unfolding. And I'm embarrassed to say how long it really took me to internalize that.
Yeah. And don't you think that the interesting thing about that is that we both had experience as athletes where you knew the difference of when the coach pulled me aside and gave me stuff that I could use right there in that game, and when it was practice the next day and she's going through my faults and I'm like, this is just humiliating. I don't want to hear it. That evaluation at the end was so much less impactful on how I changed what I was doing. And I think that's the piece, is if we're going to be allies to our students in this wrestling match with writing, we've got to get in there when they're still ready to do more of that wrestling.
And not only get in there with a nudge, but to get in there with some sort of acceptance of what's already been written. you know, some sort of positive response to that paper first. I forget who said it, but you know, the first job is to accept the paper.
Graves.
Not to write, not, you know, how many times early in my career was the first thing a student saw on a paper when they got it back was frag, you know?
And did you learn, I learned to do this. I would look over my comments and go, where's the positive feedback? Like you didn't, I mean, I learned to force myself to do that because there were times when you haven't written a single thing that celebrates anything, right?
The other, I think the other assessment thing too is, and we've talked about this in other places, but is just this sort of devotion to a very finite rubric, right? And trying to decide if the introduction's good or very good or excellent. And, you know, and I think reading Maya Wilson's work, you know, rethinking rubrics, reimagining writing assessment really changed the way I thought about grading papers, you know, in 180 days and in 4 essential studies. We talk about, you know, 1-point rubrics, or if you want to call them exemplars. That's a big shift from early in my career when I can remember paper after paper sitting at home, adding up numbers and dividing by 5. And it's just such a, you know, even the brand new issue of Educational Leadership, which just arrived in my mailbox yesterday, has a few articles from fairly respected educators about, you know, diving deep into rubrics. And that's just not where my or your journey has taken us as writing teachers.
Yeah, and I think that is an important distinction to make, right? I think that's part of why we have aligned ourselves to each other, is that we share so many of the same fundamental principles about leading young people to rich lives as readers and writers that are different than some of our colleagues, right? And you need those people in your life that help you, because we also disagree on all kinds of things, but that helps me because your disagreements help me think more deeply about big ideas like grading. And I'm going to link on the Padlet feedback fallacy, because I still think that's one of the most powerful articles I've read on feedback from the Harvard Business School that just really focuses on how the brain responds to feedback. The more we know, the better we teach, right? So mistakes.
What does that article say? It says something like focusing on the shortcomings smothers.
Right. It's like paying attention to your, you know, your strengths catalyzes learning, right? That's different than smothering it with too much attention to mistakes. So I think it's important for teachers to know that I wrote on Twitter one afternoon, you know, nobody has done research on how to teach well during a pandemic. Nobody. It's been impossible. And we are all out there. We've done the best we could. I have been more critical of myself over these last 2 semesters of pandemic teaching than in most stages of my career, because I kept comparing myself to the penny that taught for all those years without these new restrictions. And just to know that, you know, any mistakes we make, we try to figure out a way to get better, to not make them again.
Yeah, you know, I just always joked that I hope I never see my first class because they will get together and file a class action lawsuit. But I think that's kind of a superficial joke because, you know, there are a lot of good things that went on in those classrooms. And here's another thing I learned late in my career. It's about way more than the curriculum. I think earlier in my career, it was like, I'll keep I'm not your friend. I'm the teacher. Yeah. Here's what we're going to learn. And it took me many years to figure out that if I connect with you on a personal level, you are going to want to develop your literacy skills. You're going to be a lot more motivated to go down the road that I'd like you to go down.
That's interesting, Kelly, because you know, of course, we get very detailed evaluations at the college. I wish we got those all through our career, but kids write very honest comments in the sections that they're asked to respond to. And my students, more than anything this fall, were writing things like, she really took the time to listen to me. She understood where I was coming from, right? Those comments that are about, they're late to class again, or they didn't feel like they could come in, the pandemic has made the social emotional connection between kids and each other, the community in the classroom and the teacher, so critically important. And to not shy away from those and realize you can't do it all. You can't do all the curriculum.
Yeah, I mean, this would have to be a 5-hour show if we're going to go back and really look at. I mean, that's just one
Right.
on the writing side. I mean, we could talk for a long time about the imbalance of my students' reading diet for years and years and years, and how we approach and how we chopped books up so that they become unrecognizable. I mean, I've done all of that.
Well, how about following what your colleagues said was the right thing to do because you didn't feel like you had a voice? And my, colleagues, when I first joined the high school department, were like, what kind of a teacher wouldn't teach Huck Finn? And not for 9 weeks. What are you talking about? Right. When I could tell none of them were reading it. That is hard stuff. Going back in and going, I'll just do it better.
Yeah. That raises a whole nother issue. And that is this idea. And we talked about this briefly before we came on of, once you're on a school site, how do you grow professionally? I know both you and I have had conversations that our faculty meetings or late start meetings were often, let's talk about a strategy here or there without any context, or, it really wasn't about, deepening your thinking about pedagogy.
Well, and it was, for our building, if you had a PLC meeting, you had to take notes, you had to submit them, you had to, tack them onto this long-term plan so that you spent time doing busy work for administrators and you only had so much time to really talk to each other. And so I felt like our conversations too often skimmed the surface of something that was much deeper or worthy of study. And so that's why when I became a literacy coach, and still had my classroom to bounce things off of, I started bringing book studies in. And I had really admire all the people out there that are gathering in book studies. I was in one in Michigan last week that's reading 4 essential studies and just pushing back against, does this fit us, and how, and what does this mean for our work, is really how I grew the most.
I always thought if I were a principal, every faculty meeting would be around an article. Something about teaching.
Yeah.
Well, which is another mistake as we wrap up. That's another mistake early in life is, well, I'll just close my door. I'll just do whatever the hell I want. And I think, there's a rebelliousness there that's kind of attractive, but on the other hand, that's deadly in the long term. I mean, I think if you're not getting nourished as a teacher on site, then you have to find somebody like Penny or somebody in your department who thinks the same that you do. And you need somebody to bounce thinking off of and to lean against when things are rough.
Absolutely. I love that phrase, to lean against. I want to say, as we're closing up here, it's March 29th. Applications for the Book Love Foundation grants close April 1st. We got a lot of money to give away. So I hope people will spend a few moments and fill that out.
Put that in the link too, right?
Yep, I will. All right. Good to talk to you, Kelly, and to the greater conversation in the educational world.
Have a good day, everybody. We'll see you all tomorrow.
Absolutely.